Hey, everybody, and welcome to our sixth video by my count. And I hope you all had a wonderful July 4th holiday. And we are joined today by Kitty, right there he is. I get an occasional question about him on email, and a couple of you have shared pictures of your kitties, and I appreciate that very much. And Charlie appreciates it too. I was always a dog person growing up. We always had dogs in our family, but never cats. But for the last 15 years, Charlie has been my best buddy. So here he is. He's with us for as long as he feels like it, and then he'll leave us, which is what cats do. Anyway, today I want to do a couple things. I want to wrap up our discussion of Hunger Games, a couple things I want to touch on. Particularly, I want to share your answers to some of the analysis questions that I ask you to do for homework for the quiz. And again, your answers were very, very interesting, so I wanted to share those. We talked the other day about how it has examples of dystopian fiction in it. We talked about how it's a good example of classical archetypes. And we also talked a little bit about how it satirizes. I guess satirize might not be the right word, because satire implies it's going to be funny. And of course, there's nothing funny about the Hunger Games, but it is making comments about our society by sharing this horrific world of the future where 24 kids try to kill one another every year. So we talked about that. So I won't cover your answers to those particular questions, but I did want to talk a little bit about some of the other questions that were in that assignment. So we're going to share those. I want to talk a little bit about my hypothetical related situation to the Hunger Games, which I think kind of shares my idea about how this is a great work of dystopian fiction, and it opens up all kinds of conversation. Of course, this is children's literature, so I wouldn't probably discuss these things with a child audience or a child classroom. But once they get to, well, most of you said the age appropriateness for this book would be around middle school. So I think by the time they get into middle school, you might be able to talk about some of the things I'm going to bring up today. So we're going to wrap all that up. Then I want to talk a little bit about fairy tales and the characteristics and qualities and motifs and conventions of fairy tales, which I had you look at. And I'll kind of go over that as a mini lecture. And then I will share your answers to your analysis of the Golden Book fairy tales. I'll save those until Thursday's video. I'm actually recording this on Sunday, so I don't have those yet. So I'll kind of prepare our discussion and our examples of that today, and then I will share what you came up with, and I look forward to looking at those as well. And then preview a little bit folk tales. I've been promising you that these videos will be a little bit shorter than they have been. The last one ended up being about as long as the rest of them, but I really do think this one will be a little bit shorter. So I'll give you a little bit of a break, at least today. Of course, if I don't stop yammering on, it'll end up being as long as they usually are. Let me give you the first number three. Number three. Okay, but I do want to explain first the homework for Wednesday by midnight. And it does deal with folk tales as kind of a continuation of our discussion of fairy tales. And I mentioned this the other day, the two genres are very, very much related, and they share a lot of common qualities and characteristics. The main difference between fairy tales and folk tales is that fairy tales can be set anywhere at any particular time, whereas folk tales are set obviously in a very specific setting. That's what makes them folk tales. So they may be set in Asia, or they may be set in America, or they may be set in Mexico, or whatever. Um, Other than that, they often share many of the same qualities and characteristics, which what I will be talking about today. All right, so here are your assignments due by midnight Wednesday, July 10th. Obviously, watch this lecture and take note of the numbers in sequence. You guys have been doing a pretty good job of that. I noticed the last time, though, a couple of you missed a number or two, and I don't know quite how to explain that. Just make sure you watch all of the video and make sure you record all of the numbers to get full credit for the assignment. All right. Again, as we continue our discussion and our coverage of folk tales, there are some readings in the packet that I'd like you to take a look at. 107A and B, and then 119 to 137 deals with one of the issues that we've seen in children's literature over the last, I don't know, 70 or 80 years, ever since Disney became a company, ever since Walt Disney, who was a genius, started his animation way back with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs back in the 30s. A lot has been made over the years of what Disney has done to classic tales, classic fairy tales, folk tales, mythological tales. And of course, it's popularized these stories and, reintroduced them to a modern audience. But when that kind of thing happens, there are criticisms. So that information, those articles kind of deal with what people have had to say about what Disney has done to these stories over the years. I think most of us have grown up with Disney. I'm sure many of you are Disney fans and have seen many, many Disney versions of these stories, but they're not without controversy. And I wanted to familiarize you with the controversy surrounding that. So that's what those articles deal with. Then again, looking over folk tales, there are a couple of websites I included in Canvas that I'd like you to review. One of them is a really good website that not only kind of explains folk tales, but also gives a lot of great examples and summarizes a lot of great folk tales that are out there for kids to read. So check that out. Also, I am going to go over the midterm, prepare you for the midterm, which you will be taking next weekend. So in preparation for that, review the midterm study guide in the Canvas, and I will be going over that in Thursday's video. So we're already at the midterm time. Things go fast when you only have 7 weeks. Also, Lauren and Tyara, you are in the folktale, fairy tale, myth group of presenters. So your written presentation is due as well. So email that to me. And then everybody's going to do the folktale assignment file in the Canvas, which will be your 30-point quiz. And I will go over that and explain that right now. This is a very recent picture of Charlie. There's a great place in Akron called the Retro Attic, and they have all kinds of stuff, CDs, movies, DVDs, all kinds of nostalgic stuff. And I always like to go through, and they always change the stuff almost weekly. And I was there last week and I saw this big Scooby-Doo stuffed animal, and I said, well, I got to get that. So that's Charlie with Scooby-Doo, plotting their next adventure. So that's what that's all about. All right, let me share with you the homework and explain that. All right, this is your experience with working with folk tales. For years, when I did this in a regular classroom situation, I would bring in a a bunch of folk tales, hard copies, and I would distribute them to the students in small groups. And they would look over the folk tales and then do this assignment. Then COVID hit, and the year we were in COVID, I decided to do it a little bit differently because there are so many great video versions on YouTube of these folk tales. And since we weren't meeting in class, I thought, well, what students could do then would be to find a couple of these examples of folk tales on YouTube and watch how the story is presented in video form, and then do the assignment that way. And it proved to be very popular. So even after we went back to a regular classroom situation, I still do it this way. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. And I kind of did all the research for you. There's like almost three pages of YouTube videos. I'm not going to assure you that they are all still available. You know, YouTube's kind of funny. They'll have a video up for a while, then for whatever reason, it goes away. But I'm pretty sure most of these are still available. You just have to click on the link and watch them. And most of them don't last much longer than about 5 or 6 minutes, because folk tales, generally speaking, are relatively short, just like fairy tales. So it doesn't take long to tell the story. And I try to include a wide variety of folk tales from all different regions of the world. And in many cases, the title will kind of tell you what the story is about, and also give you some indication about the setting of the story, what kind of folk tale it is. Let me give you a second number here. How about 23? 23, I'll slip that in on you. So look these over, and what I'd like you to do is, as it says here, pick any two that look interesting to you, and then watch the video version, watch the story, and then do a number of things. And you can just list them this way. You don't have to write a full-fledged paper. But obviously, tell me the origin of the story. In other words, where it comes from, what country or what continent or whatever, what culture does it come from, what time period it involves, if there is a set time period. Then the next thing I'd like you to do is summarize the plot for me. Well, summarize it for us, because this will be another thing I'm going to ask everybody to share. I'll put these all together. I'll compile these and then share them all with you. So summarize the plot in a few sentences. What's the story about? Then what are some potential themes? And again, remember when I ask you for themes, I'm asking you about what would be some potential lessons that this story may teach, if any. And again, like a lot of fairy tales, folk tales also have a lesson that is presented perhaps at the end. So is there any lesson to the story? Is there any moral to the story, so to speak? Is there any message that might be shared in the story? So chances are it's a very entertaining story that reveals something about the setting and the culture it represents, but also it may very well share a theme or a message. So let me know what that is. You know, a lot of these go back many, many, many years, like a lot of folk tales and a lot of fairy tales, and of course, myths. So one question that comes up is, might they be a little bit too dated or maybe not relevant to a child in the 21st century? So the next question is, analyze its appropriateness and relevance to today's child audience. So do you think the story, even though it may be very, very old, still has relevance to a child audience today? Or might there be some potential issues or even controversies involved in sharing this book with children of today? And then finally, do a little bit of analysis and critique of the presentation of the video of the story. Are there any weaknesses in either the story or the presentation? And this will be a YouTube clip, most likely. All right, so 5 different things I'm going to ask you to touch on for each of the 2 folktales you choose. And then the second thing, we always do this in class and it's kind of fun. Come up with a rhyme to remember. And by that I mean come up with a 2-line rhyme that sums up each story and maybe reveal something about the message or moral of the story as well. And it sounds like an easy thing to do, but students sometimes struggle with this. And sometimes the results are really good. Sometimes they're kind of fun because they're so awful. But anyway, give it a shot. And then, as I said, we will be sharing these eventually as well. So again, there's so many great choices here. And again, I tried to pick folk tales from a variety of different places because every culture, every country in the world, it seems, has their own set of folk tales. So pick any 2 of these and do the assignment, and this will be due by Wednesday at midnight. And I think that'll be a pretty good way of exposing you to folk tales. And instead of perhaps reading a written version of the folk tale, you get a chance to be a kid again and go on a YouTube clip and actually watch the video. And it may be animated, or there may be a variety of different ways it's presented in the YouTube clip, but please do that for me. All right, the next thing I wanted to do is take a few minutes to share your comments on the Hunger Games and your analysis, particularly the last couple of questions. Like I said, we took on, or at least I gave you my answers basically to a couple of the earlier questions the other day. And almost all of your answers mirrored pretty much what I had to say. So I'm not going to cover those again, although you can read everything over again if you want here. I have it all here. But I wanted to focus on, Katniss as a hero. Are there other works for kids that use classical archetypes? And you guys came up with some good answers to that. I also was very interested to read your criticisms of the work, and you had some really valid criticisms. Many of you did. Most of you seemed to enjoy the book. A couple of you said that you really enjoyed it when you read it the first time when you were a kid. Well, like Shreya, for example, she said she really loved this series when she was reading it in middle school. So excellent answers to these questions. Shreya points out that Harry Potter has a number of classical archetypes. That's a great example. And again, even though these archetypes are like hundreds and hundreds of years old, we still see them in our popular fiction today. Katniss is independent. Other good role models, Lyra from His Dark Materials, Annabeth from Percy Jackson. I think like I said, I think we all kind of agreed that the age appropriateness here would be somewhere in middle school. Lauren had an excellent example to some of the other things that are being criticized in our society in the book. So I encourage you to read her answer to this. Very well done. Other works that use classical archetypes, don't judge I can't talk. Don't judge a girl by her cover by Ali Carter. That's one I was not familiar with. I'm going to check that one out. Percy Jackson, a number of you mentioned Percy Jackson. That's also a wonderful example of a work for kids that uses a lot of classical archetypes. That's really what the story is all about, isn't it? Percy dealing with the fact that he has links to gods and goddesses of classical mythology. Some criticisms here compared to Lord of the Flies, which I thought was very interesting. And Katniss, again, is a wonderful role model. I love this comment. She clearly has post-traumatic growth, which victims often are resentful of when considering how they got it. She is smart and should be celebrated. She is brave, and that should also be celebrated. A couple of comments by Haley. Again, we talked about the archetypes that we see in the story. She mentioned other works, Anne of Green Gables. The Twilight series has some classical archetypes. And again, Harry Potter does. Criticisms, a number of you mentioned that, the story is very violent. I tried to make the point the other day that I think Collins, even though the premise is obviously horrifically violent, I think Collins in a way sort of downplays the violence, doesn't linger too long on it. And I think the movie is, at least the first movie is like that. I think the other movies get progressively more violent as things, escalate, obviously. But yes, that's another reason why age appropriateness is so important. Could this be too violent for a certain age of child? Yes, I think that's true. But most of you read it. If you read it before, you read it in middle school, and that seemed to be an appropriate age. You were old enough then to handle the mature themes and the violence in the story. But it is a very violent premise, definitely. Hermione Granger, obviously excellent example of another female role model. Nancy Drew, and again, Anne of Green Gables mentioned. Kaylin. Other works that have classical archetypes, the Divergent series, the Chronicles of Narnia, and of course, we're going to be reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Again, criticisms, this can be a scary topic. And again, the kinds of things that we talk about in regards to dystopian fiction might go over the heads of younger readers, but maybe by the time they're in middle school. And again, I mentioned this before, this is the only book I teach both in children's literature and in Lit for Young Adults. It kind of straddles the line there. I think at some point they can be mature enough and old enough to get some of the more mature themes and messages as well. Let me give you another number, 29. 29. She made a good list of qualities and characteristics that Katniss has as a role model. And again, other great role models for girls. Hermione mentioned again, Mulan, Kim Possible, Moana, and again, Nancy Drew. Nancy Drew mentioned again. Irali. Other works, again, Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, Chronicles of Narnia. And again, I'm glad people mentioned that because that kind of previews what we're going to be reading a little bit later on for fantasy. I have that in the fantasy genre, but it can fall under some of these other genres as well. Other great role models, Matilda, Scout Finch. Oh, I love this book. To Kill a Mockingbird. That's a book I teach in Lit for Young Adults. Wonderful book, classic book, and a great movie too. Jenna made a nice list of archetypes in the Hunger Games. Many of all of these, I think we kind of talked about in my list. And again, Divergent, The Giver, The Journey in Search of Knowledge, The Other Hero uses those archetypes. And again, a number of these have been mentioned a number of times. This is interesting, and I tend to agree, at least to a certain point. She says, while I think Katniss is a great role model for young girls, I think that the love story between her and Peeta instills the wrong message in young women. And of course, she also brings up the violence. I would answer that just by saying, at least there is a proto-feminist twist to the story in that she she doesn't depend on him to rescue her, which is so much the theme of classical fairy tales and folk tales, the girl waiting for her Prince Charming, so to speak. This story just flips that on its ear. And, if there's a damsel in distress, it's PETA. So I like that twist. And, when I teach the book, both in children's lit and even in young adult lit, I don't really spend a lot of time on, the love triangle between her and PETA and Gail. And, there's always that tension about, especially in the later books, Gail doesn't do much in the first book, but in the second and third book, he becomes much more important. And there becomes this question, who's she going to end up with? And who is she going to be with? And I really don't care as an old man. But I think that's the kind of thing that would draw young readers in, that romantic angle. So I think that's probably why Collins included that, even though, it's kind of cliched or whatever. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just maybe trying to explain her choices there. Gabby, whoops, I also included her quiz answers. I didn't mean to do that. Right, Percy Jackson mentioned again, Matilda mentioned. Main criticism she has is that I think a lot of the more subtle complexities and criticisms aren't going to be picked up, and I think that's true. Other characters that are good role models, Annabeth Chase from the Percy Jackson series. Emma says she had a very soft spot in her heart for this novel, so I'm glad to hear that. Other good role models, Donis Firekeeper from Firekeeper's Daughter. Sophie from Howl's Moving Castle, that's a great example. And Mirabelle from Encanto, that's a great example. So thankfully, and this is a relatively recent phenomenon in world literature, the rise of the female protagonist, the female hero. So there's more and more good examples of these coming out all the time. The City of Ember is mentioned. Oops, I didn't give credit. Grace, fucked that one up. So again, very well done. No shortage of female role models in literature, in movies, pop culture, which is an excellent, wonderful trend in literature, and we hope to see more of that. Also, no shortage of examples of modern day stories or even stories that are set in the future, which actually go back to the ancient storytelling archetypes from mythology. So hopefully this exercise kind of helped you see some of those points and provided examples for you. And your answers then provided those for us. So well done on that account. So again, thank you for that. Let me give you another number, 44. All right, let me touch a little bit on qualities, characteristics of fairy tales, and then I will read your comments on the Golden Book fairy tales that I assigned for you to read. We'll go over those on Thursday. But I ask you to look over this list, and I think this is a pretty good compilation of the kinds of things that make fairy tales fairy tales. So if you're asking, what kind of story is this? And you say, well, it's a fairy tale. And if somebody prodded you and said, well, what do you mean by that? What is it that makes it a fairy tale? I mean, it's like we all know it when we see it. And the reason we do is because we've read these and we've seen these since we were children. You know, fairy tales obviously are a very popular form of storytelling for children, and then they stay with us for the rest of our lives. And I've listed here things that really make fairy tales fairy tales. So when we're critiquing fairy tales, when we're analyzing them, when we're trying to understand why this is a really good example of a fairy tale, again, we can use these criteria to help, you know, make our determination. And that's what I'm asking you to do in the Golden Book fairy tales. So I'm asking you to read through all of those and then make some general observations and comments and criticisms based on this list. So we'll just go through these real quick. I put them in 3 different categories. The first category would just be general characteristics. These are the kinds of things we see in fairy tales. And I would also add, and you can make a mental note of this, I would also add that these are probably qualities and characteristics that we also see in folk tales. So the list is pretty much the same. And again, the main difference between fairy tales and folk tales is that, you know, fairy tales can be set anywhere at any time. In fact, a lot of times the setting is purposely vague, whereas in folk tales, you have a very clearly represented setting. So here they are, heroes and heroines. And again, this is great that we now have more and more females being the center of the story, the protagonists in the story. Also, I guess I should point this out too. You know, notice how the things we learned about in mythology kind of carry over into these other stories. So one kind of feeds off the other and borrows from the other. So as time passes and we move from mythology to fairy tales and folk tales, notice how the later genres still borrow things from the previous genre. So heroes and heroines represented display traits to overcome adversity. And again, this is very close to the hero myth. Other things that are characteristics of a fairy tale. So if you're analyzing your fairy tale, this is one of the things you look for. The plot lines are very clear, very direct. They're very good at starting in the middle of things, in medias res. There isn't a lot of backstory in most fairy tales. You know, you get the premise very quick, and then the story plays out in a few pages. So the plot lines are clear. There's very little ambiguity. It's usually pretty clear right from the bat who's good and who's evil, which person is right and which is wrong, and is very clearly represented. There's very little gray area in fairy tales. Like I said, a good fairy tale is really a very effective, concise way of presenting a story in as few words as possible. So the conflict is usually identified very early in the story. There's not pages and pages of exposition. So it's clear what the conflict is early on. The resolution at the end is usually very, very decisive. The characters are described very, very economically. They are usually types, stereotypes, if you will. And again, this is the kind of thing I think that kids maybe like about fairy tales, is because once you've read a few fairy tales and you kind of get the premise and you get these characteristics, then as you read on, you'll see these types show up in other stories and you'll be familiar with them, you know. So if a witch shows up in a story, we can pretty much know that this is going to be an evil character because we've seen witches in other stories. Same with the wolf in the story, usually a bad guy. Now, again, this is the main difference between fairy tales and folk tales. In fairy tales, the setting is often vague and the time period is vague. You know, once upon a time in a place far, far away, you know, nothing specific. And usually I talk in class about the benefits of this. What's the benefit of making the time and place vague instead of saying, well, this is a story that's set in Pittsburgh in 1948. Well, it allows the child to, it draws them in, and it allows them maybe to better identify with the story if it's a vague setting, right? I ask you to talk about the themes and messages that you see in the fairy tales. And usually these themes and values and messages and lessons are very clear, um, usually come at the end, if not before that. All different types of fairy tales, including talking animals, what we call a noodle head, cumulative stories that build on each other, trickster tales. So even within the realm of folk tales and fairy tales, there are other subgenres. Usually somebody will ask me, what's a noodlehead story? And I think the best example I can think of isn't really a fairy tale, but it's a famous story. I think everybody knows uh, Forrest Gump. You know, the main character is somebody that's maybe not particularly bright but somehow stumbles into adventures and always seems to come out on top, even though uh, their their opponents are much smarter than they are. Um, so those are general characteristics that we see. This has to do with how the plot and story is set up. Other kinds of characteristics I'll call conventions. And again, these are the kinds of things that very clearly delineate what a fairy tale is. And kids get used to these things pretty quickly. First of all, a lot of fairy tales have repetition. Ideas are repeated, phrases are repeated. Uh, Sometimes the fairy tales rhyme or have rhyming passages. Another very common convention is the three construction. You ever wonder why most of these stories have three, say three little pigs or Goldilocks and the Three Bears? And there have been a lot of different theories about this. And some even go into religious ideas, the Holy Trinity. I think the more practical answer to this is it just works as storytelling. You know, two examples would not be enough. Four would be too many. But three is just the right number. Or, in the case of, the Three Bears, this is too hot. This is too cold. This is just right. You know, a lot of a lot of jokes are set up in the three construction. You know, uh, three bums walk into a bar. Most jokes are set up with the three construction because it works as storytelling. So maybe a few of the fairy tales you read in the Golden Book collection will have the three construction obvious. Again, another common convention, once upon a time is a very common beginning or something similar. Long ago and far away is also a very common convention to make the setting purposely vague so you can put yourself in the situation. You don't have to distance yourself. And often, not always, but a lot of times, most of the time, these stories have happy endings. Good triumphs over evil, and the two lovers wind up together. Doesn't always happen, but that's usually what happens. And then the third classification is what I would call motifs. These are common ingredients that we see in fairy tales. By the way, let me give you another number. How about 56? 56. And so, from fairy tale to fairy tale, again, they're not like folk tales where, or myth where we have the same characters show up from one story to the next. But we have these conventions, and again, children, after you read a few fairy tales, you start to get into your head these conventions. And the cool thing about this is, once you're used to the conventions or the archetypes that are used, then you don't need a lot of backstory because you're already familiar with, the concept, because you've been there before. This is a different story with different characters. But again, if a wolf shows up, hey, I know from other fairy tales that, I shouldn't trust this wolf, or if this witch shows up or whatever. So these are some of the common motifs and conventions: talking animals, objects. This might be the child's first experience with, a literature term that I think we're all familiar with, which would be personification. Magical beings. Uh, so many of these stories are set in castles or mysterious woods and forests. Uh, the contrasts are set up pretty distinctly in fairy tales. Things like rich versus poor, old versus young, good versus evil, beautiful versus ugly. Just as I go through these, you can probably think of half a dozen fairy tales that use each of these as their common motifs. A lot of times there's trickery involved, which might give a child audience their first experience with what we would call a plot twist. We think the story's going one way, and then, there's a twist. And I think we all enjoy twist stories, and we see them first, I think, in some fairy tales. I think you see a few examples of that in the Golden Book collection, by the way. Oh my gosh, go figure. One of the common motifs in fairy tales are fairies as characters. And again, wolves and witches. And another motif that we see in these stories that I think is kind of unfair. I always felt bad for the real stepmothers in the world who I'm sure most love their children and try to do well by them. But stepmothers come off pretty poorly in a lot of these fairy tales. And again, a child reads one story with an evil stepmother. The next time they read a story with another stepmother, uh-oh, that's going to be bad. Again, some of these borrow from myths. A lot of these fairy tales involve the character having to go on a journey or a trek, and they have to accomplish something. Maybe they have to accomplish 3 things. They don't have to accomplish 12 things. That would be too long. Again, 3 is the good number. Or they have tasks to complete, as it says here. Also, along the way, they may encounter and use sidekicks or helpers or mentors. And again, all of these are concepts that go back to classical mythology. Let's face it, a lot of these stories involve wishes being granted. And again, it's not 2 wishes, and it's not 4 wishes, usually 3 wishes. And another common motif, and we usually kick this around in class, kind of joke about this. Boy, in a lot of these stories, she sees him, he sees her, bang, zoom, they're in love. No backstory, no couple of pages of courtship. They don't go on dates before they find out they love one another. No, it's right then and there, boom. All right. And I put a little joke in there, if only. I usually ask the class, how many of you believe in love at first sight? And usually by the time students are 20, 21, 22, they become jaded and they don't believe it anymore. But there are an occasional story. Somebody will say, well, my grandparents met when they were 15 and knew immediately, and they've been together ever since. So there are stories like that. I think it still exists somewhere in the world. A little picture from The Star is Born. I don't know why I did that. Anyway, other kinds of motifs, transformations, characters changing from one thing to another. Almost always these stories, and here might be an issue that might be a little bit more controversial and dated. The main characters are usually incredibly handsome and unbelievably beautiful, and that signifies goodness. So if you look good and you're pretty or you're handsome, that must mean you're good. Meanwhile, if you're evil, then you're going to be ugly. And hopefully we've kind of progressed from that kind of idea of personal appearance, physical appearance or whatever. My favorite example of this, there is a fairy tale, I can't think of the name of it now, but the main female character, her name was the Princess of Inexhaustible Loveliness. That was her name. Not Mary, not Jane, or whatever. Boy, if that doesn't tell you everything right there. She was known as the Princess of Inexhaustible Loveliness. So, we kind of scratch our head at something like that. But that's usually what happens, the most beautiful princess, the most beautiful girl in the land ends up with the most handsome prince in the land, and they live happily ever after. And we can debate the realism of that, certainly. And again, some other things we see in a lot of these stories, spells are cast, curses are put upon characters that they have to overcome. And, a lot of objects take on meaning other than just their regular objects. So a lot of times fairy tales introduce to children another literature concept, which is symbolism. They begin to consider the idea, yeah, this is more than just a teapot, or this is more than just a clock, or this is more than just whatever it appears to be. It becomes something else, or it represents something else. It symbolizes something else. And fairy tales have a lot of symbolism in it. And it's a good way to introduce that concept to kids. Okay, so those are the characteristics, conventions, and motifs of fairy tales. And we could also apply them to folk tales, except for the vague setting. So as you are analyzing the fairy tales, or as you did, I hope, I'm doing this after the fact. I think you will find in the Golden Book collection a number of really good examples that share a lot of these different conventions and motifs. All right, let me give you another number here, 79. 79. One last thing I want to comment on, talk about in regards to the Hunger Games. I have a hypothetical situation for you. And again, this is not something I would probably bring up to middle school kids. Maybe I would if I thought they were a mature class or whatever. But this is one of the things I talk about in my Lit for Young Adults class. I also teach this book in my honors colloquium, and I give them this situation. I'm thinking of a TV show that I want to be the producer of. This is my baby. This is my idea. And I'm going to pitch it to the networks. And I'm pretty sure somebody will produce this. I envision this being on Fox, probably hosted by Ryan Seacrest. Okay. And the premise for my show is very similar to the Hunger Games. What we'll do is we're going to take 50 people from America, United States. And ultimately, after we've chosen the 50 from however many want to try out, we'll eventually put them on some deserted island, kind of like Survivor, with very minimal, resources and very basic tools and very basic weapons. And it will basically be like the Hunger Games. It will be a fight to the death. And in this case, in my scenario, the winner wins $50 million. Okay. Now, there's a couple of differences between my premise and the Hunger Games. Number one, if you'll notice, it's all volunteer. So there's no pulling your name out of a hat or whatever. Nobody's forced to do this. Okay, it's all volunteer. All right, I'm not going to make anybody do this. And the second difference is I would have an age restriction. They have to be adults, so there's no children. There's not going to be any children involved. I think I'd probably make the age 21. You have to be 21 to try out for my Hunger Games, Shank's Hunger Games. And you can try out, you can volunteer. All right. But what I'll probably do is it'll be kind of like American Idol. If you ever watched American Idol, the first couple of weeks of American Idol, they don't even start the competition yet. They show they show videos of all the tryouts from major cities across the country. So I would have tryouts in all the different major cities. So there'd be one tryout in Cleveland, LA, Chicago, whatever, where anybody who wanted to try out would would come to show some skill or something that they're good at that they think would make them interesting and somebody we'd want to see compete for $50 million in a battle to the death. And by the way, this is not fake. This is not, reality TV, only it's fake. This is really, we're really talking about people killing one another. And my show, it would be 24/7. We'd have cameras everywhere, like in the Hunger Games. So you could tune in on it anytime you wanted. And then usually every day or every night, we'd have a recap or a highlight show where we'd show what happened that day and who got killed and whatever. All right, so it'd be live television and people really killing them. So you get the premise, volunteers from across the country. We whittle it down to 50 people who we thought might be qualified contenders or might be interesting. We'd send them off somewhere and they'd kill each other off until we had one winner who would get $50 million. Of course, they'd have to sign waivers and all kinds of stuff because obviously we're breaking about 100 different laws. But that's my scenario. Now, if this were a classroom situation, I'd throw it open. I'll just ask you these and have you think about the answers to this. Number one, be honest about this. If there was such a show, would you volunteer? Would you say, yeah, that's something, $50 million. I would like to try out for that. Yeah, I know I could get killed, but $50 million. Now, usually, I'm going to cut to the chase on all these questions. Usually after kicking around in class, almost everybody in class says, hell no, I wouldn't do that. Are you kidding, Shank? That's a crazy idea. I'd get killed. I have no skills whatsoever. Forget it. All right, so that's generally the answer to that question. But my second question is, do you think a lot of people would try out? Do you think a lot of Americans from across the country, like I said, and there'd be tryouts in all the major cities of America? Do you think there would be a lot of, do you think I'd have any trouble finding people who would want to participate? And sadly, after we kick us around for a while in class, sadly, the answer to that question is yes. I think there would be thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe, of people who would try out for this. And I think that's the nature, and that's what's great about a dystopian scenario, is that it helps reflect the country and the situation and the times we live in. And I think it's a sad commentary that in our world today, there would be no shortage of volunteers who would be risking certain death. I mean, there can only be one winner. I mean, chances are you're going to die, but you would take that chance to win $50 million. Kind of opens your eyes to a situation. I mean, what kinds of people, who would do this? People who were so desperate, who felt like in America, even in 2024, they have no other prospects. They look ahead to their future and they say, I might as well do this because I'm looking ahead and my life is so miserable and I have no opportunities and no chance. I might as well do this. I'm also thinking a lot of people who would try out for this might be former military. These were people who were trained in combat. And then they did their time and they went back to civilian life and they don't fit in and they're not making any money and they've been ignored by the Veterans Administration. And they're thinking to themselves, I might as well, I was trained for this. That's scary. And I'm sure there's just a number of sadly, misguided people who think they would have a shot at it when they really didn't. But see, all that's a very sad commentary. The other question I ask is, do you think, no, the second question I would ask is, would you watch this show that I've proposed? And we kick this around a little bit in class too. And usually, it's not as clear cut. There are a number of people in the class who said, yeah, I'd watch it. Most people say, no, 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 Shank, that's disturbing and that's gross and that's horrible. That's entertainment, to see people trying to kill one another for $50 million. I wouldn't watch that. And I think like I said, there are some people who are kind of honest and would say, curiosity, or, um, I usually make the point, we see horrific violence in all other forms of entertainment. This is just the next step, really. We're so used to fake violence. Now that doesn't satisfy us anymore. Now let's move on to the real stuff. And again, that's the kind of answer that, is disturbing, or should be disturbing. And it's the kind of question that arises in a dystopian scenario like this. I think this would be the biggest thing on television. I think it would get the biggest rating. I think it would be bigger than the Super Bowl or whatever. And that's kind of a sad commentary too. So it would be popular, and it would be something that too many of us would be willing to get involved with, because our lives just aren't satisfying, and and that's the kind of thing that a good dystopian scenario elicits. So I thought I was kind of throw that out there. And you could talk about other things like, we are attracted to the sensational and violence and whatever. And could you turn away? Could you not watch it? It would probably be, like I said, I think it would be the biggest thing on TV. And I think that says something, sadly, maybe. And I don't mean the America bash, like, oh, this is something that Americans would love, but maybe people in other countries wouldn't. I think it's more of a human nature kind of thing, you know. So anyway, that's Shank's Hunger Games. And I always end by saying, I think it would be popular. I think this is the kind of show you could do for years and years. Every year you'd start with a new scenario and 50 new people. And I think the only thing that might hurt it would be, after a while, and this is another sad commentary, after a while, people might start to get bored with it. Oh, we're going to watch Shank's Hunger Games again this year. Been there, done that. I'd have to try to find new ways to make it more exciting. And so anyway, sorry to lay that really disturbing scenario on you, but I don't know that we're that far away. I like to think that most of us wouldn't want to have anything to do with my idea, and I'd like to think that every network that I took my idea to would all say, Shank, you're sick, you're twisted, we don't want to have anything to do with your idea. But man, I can't help but think that there are a lot of people who might want to watch it and might want to take part in it. And we got to ask ourselves the question, why is that? All right, so that's my little Hunger Games scenario. I thought maybe I would share with you also my Shrek rant. A couple of you asked me about that, but I think I'm going to save that. I think I'm going to save that for another time, just to whet your curiosity just a little bit more. So again, I'm going to let you go. I think that's all I have for today. So the assignment is due by Wednesday at midnight, the folktale assignment. And again, if you're in the two students who are in the folktale, fairy tale, myth presentations, those are also due. Also, make sure again that you review the midterm study guide, because I will be going over that and explaining the procedure and what we're going to do since it's online. And so until then, I'll give you the wave. Charlie took off, so he's no longer here. Thank you all, and we'll talk to you again soon.